Brilliant. Okay, so hi everybody. My name's Bliss Dewsbury, and I am facilitating tonight's brilliant webinar with Jan Dubiel. No expectations there, Jan. Just to So I have heard Jan talk about the curriculum, and he's all over YouTube as well talking about curriculum. So I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to invite him into our Stronger Practice Hub, into the inner folds, to talk about curriculum. And we've just had a little taste of it. It sounds very exciting. So with no further ado, Jan, handing it over to you. People, please do pop things in the chat if you want to. I can watch the chat. That's absolutely fine. Or Becky's on the chat as well. The idea is that we'll go up to about 7 o'clock, and then after that we'll have some time for questions and answers. Hi, Eliane. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Felicity. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome to you all. Well done. Thank you for giving up your evening to hear about curriculum and curriculum in the UIFS, and a kind of overview of what we mean by it, how important it is, and how it empowers the young children that we work with, and also how it's kind of central to what we do, whether you realise it or not. And often when I've run this session before, the debate, and it'd be interesting to see if this happens, the debate is often about the word curriculum, because sometimes it conjures up this idea of something very formal and very structured and very quite dry, which actually is, and I'll come to that. But we need to reclaim that word. One of the things I believe strongly in early years is we need to reclaim the language that we use to describe things. And the reason I think that is because early years is the beginning of the continuum. When you look at children, and I always think this in August when the A-level results come out and everyone's celebrating these fantastic results that children get, and obviously they've worked really hard and so on, and their teachers have worked really hard, but that journey starts in early years. It starts with the experiences you give them. And actually, the stronger we are about that continuum, the stronger we demonstrate how what we do in early years links directly to those children in I'm not saying it's the end of everything, but children getting good A-level results, the stronger it reinforces and validates and professionalizes our profession. I think, sorry, I'm starting off on a slightly different tack here, but I think, and I've been involved in the sector for over 30 years, and I think finally our time has come. I think finally we are on the verge of being recognised for what we do, the incredible work we do from birth to 7, how we establish the reality of children. I'm very fortunate. I work around the world, and every culture in the world has the equivalent of give me the child until they're 7 and I'll give you the adult. Everyone recognises that incredible period of growth, and that's what you do. That's what we work with. So I think our time has come, and partly, interestingly enough, it's a tiny little filament of silver in the massive cloud that was COVID. When lockdown happened, this is what's kind of thing that's influenced it. When lockdown happened, parents had to look after their own children. Takes place, the what we want children to learn. That's the definition of curriculum. Pedagogy is how we implement it. It's how we make the curriculum come alive. Curriculums are by definition really dull, really boring, and really dry. They're kind of dull sequences of the stuff that needs to happen, but it's the pedagogy that makes it come alive, and I'll come to that. An assessment is how we know that's worked. How do we know what we think we've taught has been learned? And that's where assessment comes in. So our definition of curriculum is a really important one. So this is my starting point, and it's twofold. It's what needs to be learned. Now people challenge that, rightly so, and that's fine. Let's have a debate about it. But I stick by that, because as a society, we decide what we think children need to know. We decide on the knowledges and skills and protocols and cultural elements that we think children need to exist and to thrive within the society they live. And that's not a decision we take as educators. The whole society, the whole world makes that decision. And they should do. People should be talking all the time about the early years curriculum, what should be in it, what shouldn't be in it, how should we construct it, what should it look like? Because society exists and is dependent on us enculturating those children with the right amount of the right things in order to be successful within it. So it's right that we say it's what needs to be learned, and we decide that. We decide that as adults. But alongside that, there is also everything that the child learns, which runs in parallel with this. In the Steiner school movement, there is a really beautiful phrase. I have issues with Steiner. It's an interesting an approach. One of the things they talk about is that the educator should be a person worthy of emulation. And the reason they say that, and it goes back to Marinda Montessori and some of the pioneers, is children watch you like hawks, and you are teaching them all the time, even when you don't think you are. They are constantly picking up on essentially on how to be, and they are watching you. So everything the child learns is sometimes not what you are consciously deciding to do. That's how we transfer values. That's how we transfer the way we deal with people, or the way we deal with frustration, or the way we communicate. They are picking up on that all the time. And we know that's learned behavior because there are huge cultural variables. A quick example is if any of you have been to Paris, there's a very Parisian thing, which is this, and it's kind of aggressive indifference. You say something, oh, I've lost my keys, or I can't go, it's like, I don't, it basically means I don't care. You only see it in Paris. And I remember being in Paris once, my sister lives there, and a child was running to the park, and one of them fell over and hurt his knee. And he said to her, I've hurt my knee, in French. And the other one just turned around, and they're about 2 or 3 years old, and he just went. Now, he'd learned that not as a formal lesson, and no one said, we need to teach them the Parisian gesture for aggressive indifference, but I'd picked it up through the world around them, which is how children learn. So everything the child learns is part of the curriculum because it's constructing their view of themselves and the knowledges and the strategies and the protocols they need in order to survive. So curriculum is, yes, it's really, really important. Pedagogy is how we deliver curriculum. Whereas the curriculum is very dull and dry, pedagogy is the interesting part of it. Pedagogy is how the curriculum comes alive. It's how it has meaning, how it has resonance, how it has color and sound and beauty around it. It's not the curriculum, but it's how we deliver it. So part of that is the interface between what we know about the way children learn and the craft of teaching. Teaching, and you're all teachers with a small t, teachers is art form. It's a highly intuitive, highly skilled craft. You have, as an educator, research tells us that you have typically 1,000 interactions every single day. 1,000 interactions. Each of those interactions is both a curriculum delivery point, but also how you gain information about children. And you're constantly, often subconsciously, processing that information all the time. It's a highly skilled craft, a highly skilled intuitive act. And that's why early years teaching isn't for everybody. Some people who are fantastic teachers with older children, they go into early years and they they find it very difficult because partly because they're not in control of everything, but partly because you have to tune into that nuance of individuality of children, which you will do instinctively, you will do almost subconsciously. And it's the way in which teaching happens. Now, this distinction is really important because one of the things we've learned in the past few years is that these things aren't the same, that to have a curriculum is about looking at the progression of learning, whereas the pedagogy around it is how you enable that to happen. And there are an infinite number of ways in which learning the curriculum can be delivered. And one of the things we perhaps wrestled with in the past was conflating pedagogy and curriculum as the same thing. I'm going to give you an analogy. I did try this. I literally thought of this yesterday. So this is new. You're the first people to hear it. I did trial it on Felicity earlier, and she said it wasn't as rubbish as I thought it was. So I'm gonna run with it. So you probably know that there are only 7 stories in the world, 7 plots. So every story you hear, or book you read, or play you see, or film you watch is one of 7 stories, and they're repeated in different forms the whole time. So, as an example, and I'm showing my age on this, apologies if you don't recognize any of these films, but if you don't, you should watch them. They're really good films. So, The Godfather is a film about Michael Corleone, who's the protagonist, who's a mafia boss in New York. And Star Wars is essentially about the rise of Skywalker, who turns into Darth Vader. Now, they are essentially the same plot. A good person wants to protect the people around him. To do that, he becomes a bad person. He loses sight of why he's doing it. And at the end, he repents and he dies. That's exactly the same story for both of them. And that's like the essence of curriculum. The curriculum is the stuff that happens. It lives within everything else. Now, when you watch those films, you don't think, I've seen this before, because that's not what you see. You see the action, you see the dialogue, you see the plot twists, you see the characterization, you see the special effects, you see the costumes, you see the comedy. Actually, not so much in The Godfather. But you see all those elements of it, which makes it real. And that's like the pedagogy that makes the curriculum real. So the same plot can be presented to you many hundreds and thousands of times. You'll have seen the same story hundreds and thousands of times. But because of the way it's structured and the way it's embedded, it becomes real. And that's the difference between curriculum and pedagogy. Curriculum is the dull central core of what we want to learn, and we make it alive by how we present it and how we interact with them. So Lillian Katz is, again, someone you might recognise. She was very influential on the development of early years policy in the previous Labour government, actually, as we're talking historically. She wrote this really interesting paper in 2015, which I would recommend reading. And it was all about her kind of reflections on curriculum, again, sort of towards the autumn, I think, of her career, we could say. She talks about curriculum as having different goals, different aspirations. So academic goals, which is mastery of information, but also intellectual goals. And she talks about those very powerfully as quite distinct things. Structure of academic goals, of stuff you need to learn, but intellectual goals of what you do with the knowledge and the curriculum that you have. So what she talks about in curriculum, and this is my driving quote, an appropriate curriculum includes encouragement and motivation to seek mastery of basic skills to learn stuff in the service of their intellectual pursuits. Now, I love that phrase, their intellectual pursuits, because children are highly intellectual. Children's learning from birth to 7, as you know, is this maelstrom of activity. Most connections you make between birth and 7. Some people say that up to 70 to 80% of your lifetime neurological connections happen between a birth to 7. I mean, we haven't measured that exactly, but certainly it's highly significant. Think about a newborn baby and you think about a 7-year-old, you think about the incredible journey that's taken place, and that again, that's what we are responsible for. So her view of curriculum is twofold. It's not just acquiring information, it's acquiring information for a purpose. It's acquiring information so that you pursue what you think is important. So we often talk about children's interests and children's fascinations. Again, that's a vehicle by which they embed knowledges and skills. To be a learner, you need a strong set of learning behaviors, but you also need knowledge. You need stuff to peg that on. So those things are really important and really run in tandem together. So the other perspective of that is work of Roger Salio. He's a Swedish educationalist writing in the kind of 70s and 80s. And he coined the phrase of deep and surface level learning. And again, it's a similar parallel to this, but again, highly influential in understanding what we mean by both curriculum and learning. So he talks about surface level learning. So surface level learning is acquiring information, knowing stuff, knowing what a triangle looks like, knowing what a number 4 looks like, knowing this is the color blue, and so on. And learning is also about memorizing, really being able to recall and retrieve information. Something, again, which has rose to prominence in the past few years. How do we retrieve and recall information? The theory is you have a memory of everything that's ever happened to you. Somewhere you have a memory of being born. You have a memory of being in the womb. But the problem is you can't retrieve it. You know, probably just as well in some cases. Because retrieval is a different process, and you retrieve things predominantly through language. Your earliest memories come from when you're around about 2 years old, because you develop at that point what Piaget calls your inner speech, which is the dialogue you have with yourself all the time, and it's through language that we retrieve and record information, which is why it's the first area of learning the UIFS. Language isn't just about communication, it's about the residue of thought. So he talks about surface level learning as acquiring information, storing information that you can retrieve and recall when you need it. Some information you have all the time, particularly in terms of language. Some information you have to think and retrieve it from different places. He then goes on to talk about deep level learning. So his view of curriculum and learning was that we have surface level learning, acquire information, but we also have deep level learning, and it shines very strongly with Lillian Katz's view of intellectual thought, intellectual pursuit. So he describes deep level learning as making sense or abstracting meaning, relating things to each other and to the real world. What young children do is they contextualize and make sense, take ownership of what they've been taught. And we're really lucky in early years because we see that. We see that when children go and use their resource areas, when they do in their independent activity, when they go and count the number of shells in a basket, they're retrieving and recalling and embedding what they've been taught, but they're making it meaningful to themselves. He also talked about learning as understanding reality in a different way and comprehending the world by reinterpreting knowledge. Now, that's really important because society evolves, civilization evolves when people think differently about what they know. So, for example, if you think about the pen, if you're writing with a pen at the moment, pen started life as a sharpened animal bone dipped in its own blood. That's writing. Now that's evolved to whatever writing tool you're using at the moment. And at each point in its evolution, someone's thought differently about what they know, and they've connected that together. So intellectual pursuit, cognition, the ability to think differently, is how society evolves. Every single invention that we use is built on something that's happened before, and people have adopted it. That change is incremental. Now, what's interesting is children do that quite naturally. Particularly young children, they create connections with things where there are gaps. Children will think differently and retrieve what they do know to fill in those gaps in their learning. And that is an incredible process. And I'll give you an example. So this is obviously a snake. It's called a branded crate. It lives in India. I think it eats other snakes and so on. Now, the story behind this is from an adult sharing a book with a child. And they were looking at these pictures of animals and they were talking about them and talking about what they were called and where their names came from and so on. So they came to a picture of this snake and the adult said, what do you think this is? What do you think this is called? So the child thought, now this all happened probably in a space of maybe a second and a half. So this is, incredible thinking. It's a 3-year-old. And the child said, I think it's called a bumble snake. Right. Now, the adult could have said, no, you're wrong. It's called a brandy crate, but she didn't. But that for me is an incredible piece of thinking. And if let's deconstruct that for a minute. So a child looks at that and they know it's a snake. How do they know it's a snake? Because they're retrieving all their knowledge of what a snake is, the snakeness of a snake. So when you identify that as a snake, you're looking, it's long, it's got no legs, it's got that head, it's got scales on. All of that is happening simultaneously, and that's what the child did. So that bit is relatively straightforward. That's just retrieving knowledge that that's a snake. But then what they do next is really exceptional. But sorry, it's not exceptional because I'm doing that all the time. I'll come to that in a minute. What I do is really interesting. So they don't know what that snake's called. So they don't have that piece of knowledge. So they're creative about it, and they try and decide what to call it. They look at that. When this is happening within like about a second and a half. This is pretty quick. They look at the pattern on that, and they recognize that pattern as the pattern you see on a bumblebee. So they think subconsciously a bumblebee has the same pattern as that, but it's not a bee, it's a snake. So I'm going to take off the word bee and replace it with snake, and I'm going to call it a bumble snake. Now, although that's the wrong answer, it's an incredible piece of thinking. And the reason that's not exceptional is that is happening all the time in your setting. Children are thinking like that all the time. They're taking what they know and they're adapting it to what they don't know. They're being creative. They're connecting things together. They're what Roger Salley called engaging in deep level learning. And deep level learning, let's go back a bit actually. Oops, that's the wrong way. Deep level learning is utterly dependent on surface level learning. You cannot think deeply unless you have stuff to think about. That child couldn't have said that about the snake and the bumblebee if they didn't have the knowledge about what a snake and a bumblebee was. So this isn't either or. They both interconnect and they're interplay with each other. So we know from research that there are huge strong indicators of what makes for success. So right at the beginning, I talked about what needs to be learned and how we define that. Well, actually, one of the ways we define it, and this is where this dialogue takes place, is we look at what research tells us, what makes for successful adults, what makes for successful learners. This is a piece of research from 2000, I think it's 2019. It was just before COVID. It was a response to the most recent review of EYFS. And it looked at all the research in the previous 10 years since the last review of the EYFS. And it identified, so it looked at longitudinal studies, looked at international comparisons, looked at neuroscience, and it identified the things that made for successful learners. So right on the top of that, you can see, surprisingly or not, the primary areas of learning. Primary areas of learning are fundamental to success. Children are unlikely to be successful if they do not have strong language, strong PSED, and strong physical development. And again, that ran as a thread throughout all the research. But the next things are particularly interesting because they talk about learning behaviours. We have the characteristics of effective learning, they're part of statutory EYFS, but actually this kind of goes beyond that and talks about specific learning behaviours that are implicit within that. So things like self-regulation, although that's in PSCD as an early learning goal, things like executive functioning, metacognition, working memory, and so on. To be successful, children need to be strong in those areas. And this is the point where we challenge notions of the curriculum, because those things are all learned behaviors. Self-regulation is a learned behavior. Cognitive flexibility is a learned behavior. Inhibitory control, working memory, they are all learned behaviors, which means they need to be part of the curriculum because they are something that needs to be learned. So my view of curriculum isn't just the areas of learning and development. It's those learning behaviours that enable and empower those to take place. And I'll talk about them in a minute. So right at the beginning, we've got a definition of curriculum which is about learning stuff, learning the names of shapes, learning the names of things, learning phonics, learning about books, learning that kind of concrete knowledge. But it's also about behaviours which enable that to be possible. So on that theme, this was from a piece of work which I'll come back to. In kind of about 15 years ago, or so now, people started talking about this idea of 21st century skills. So 15 years ago, our technology was on the rise. We were starting to kind of see its impact on the everyday, and that's something that's continued. So people started thinking, well, actually, what are children going to need going forward? What kinds of knowledge and skills are going to make them successful? We had perhaps a traditional view of curriculum, which was acquiring knowledge, but that wasn't going to be enough in itself. So they talked about this idea of 21st century skills. There's a huge body of work out there. I've picked out one thing, but there's many. So right in the middle is digital literacy, which is strangely absent from the EYFS. I'm sure you're teaching it anyway. And then if you look at the other side of those, learning innovation skills, career and life skills, those are about behaviors. Those aren't about knowledge. Those are about how you use knowledge, how you engage in deep level learning, how you engage in intellectual pursuits. And they can't exist by themselves. You can't just be creative. You have to be creative about something. You can't just use your initiative. You have to use your initiative around something. So one of the things that I think is really important about curriculum is that those things exist as a symbiosis. They exist in tandem. You are learning stuff, surface level learning, but you are learning how to process and work with that stuff, just like that child worked with knowledge to identify the bumble snake. He worked with what he knew and he pieced it together and he connected it together in an incredibly cognitively strong way. So what is the point of curriculum? The point of curriculum is to work with an external framework of outcomes of expectations. So we have the EYFS. It's not a curriculum. It's a set of framework. It's a set of expectations, aspirations, but gives us a structure within which we build the curriculum that's relevant for children that we work with. And again, that's a really important thing to say. Curriculum must belong to you. I'm really skeptical of curriculums that you buy off a shelf because they have to adapt around the context and experiences and nature of the children that you work with. And one of the things I do, as I say, I'm fortunate, I work around the world, is how differently they emerge and how differently they are shaped because they have to work for the needs of their children. And again, I'll give you one example. I've done a lot of work with a school in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and it's a very high-end school with children who come in with sort of entourages of maids and drivers and bodyguards and things. And when we were talking about curriculum, the single competency they wanted to focus on was independence. These children have no levels of independence because they're used to having everything done for them. So when they go into the earliest environment, they don't know what to do because they're expecting people to do things for them. So their whole curriculum was built on the central core of how do we increase independence for children. Now that's one example, but your curriculum, the way you shape your pedagogy and the way you shape the trajectory that children follow has to be driven by the nature of the children you work with. So curriculums will always be individual. So we work with an external framework. We have a legal framework, as every country in the world does for earliest children. Usually it's kindergarten, but we stop at 5 for reasons. So that's another story. Identify critical knowledge behaviours to embed core values and to enculturate children. So part of what we do as our curriculum is we enculturate children into this context that they live in. So that child who went in Paris, that was taught inadvertently and accidentally, but that was about understanding what it means to live in the society you live in. What are the protocols? What are the heritages? What is your identity within that? That's all part of how the curriculum operates. And I'm making it sound probably more complicated than it is, because you are doing this all the time. Every time you interact with a child, you are reflecting your values to them. You're reflecting what you think is important to them, and they are absorbing that really quickly. And that's what we mean by curriculum. So, some definitions of curriculum. How are we doing? Gosh, time. Curriculum is the stuff, and it's the progression of stuff. So it's the stuff we want children to learn, and it's how it progresses. So for instance, one of my criticisms of the characteristics of effective learning, I think they're brilliant and they were incredibly innovative when they came out 12 years ago. But one of the things I think needs to be revisited is they're not progressive. It's the same statement for a baby and a 5-year-old. So if you think about exploration or you think about creativity, how a baby is creative and how a 5-year-old is creative is going to be very, very different. So one of the things I do a lot of work around is how do we progress learning behaviors? How does something like self-regulation progress as children go through phases of development? It's value driven, and it's most effective when it's internalized. So we have, what do I mean by that? We have it's not curriculum, but it's our framework within which the curriculum sits. It's our set of aspirations. And we have, we have development matters, which again is a broad, non-statutory guidance about how learning might develop from birth to 3 to 4 to 5 to reception, up to the early learning goals. Obviously, you don't have to use development matters. Other frameworks are available. You don't have to use, you can use anything to look at that journey that children take through it. You can use the Turkish kindergarten guidelines if you wanted to. I presume there are some. You don't have to use development matters, but it provides a kind of structure for that. That's the basic structure of our curriculum. That describes what we want for children, the learning that needs to happen, and the progression of how that takes place. So that is the external curriculum. The curriculum that you use is the actual curriculum. It's the curriculum you use on a day-to-day basis. It's the curriculum you use with those 1,000 interactions with children. And the actual curriculum looks more like that. That's what you do on a day-to-day basis. It is not possible, nor should it be possible, to write that down or record that, because it's intuitive, it's interactive, and it's multiplicity of opportunities to do that. So you are constantly shaping your interactions around what you think is important, the curriculum, to support children, to support them where they need help, but also to extend their learning, to continue that journey. So again, one of the key messages from this session is that you have internalized what you think is important to children. I'll give you an example in a minute, because as educators, we interpret those requirements and we make them real for the children that we work with. We also take huge value-driven decisions about what that consists of. And as I said, I'll give you an example. So part of the curriculum is progression, sequence of learning, which we hear a lot about, but also curriculum is about depth. It's about making sure that progression is meaningful and is real for children. So I'll give you an example which ties all that together. So we need to distinguish between coverage and progression and depth. So coverage is what sometimes happens with the previous development matters. Coverage was ticking off whether we've done something, and you can cover things really easily. However, we know that's not effective. That's not real curriculum, because curriculum is progressive, but it's also about making sure that children fully understand a concept, an idea, a piece of knowledge. So here's an example. So in understanding the world, there are educational programs and early learning goals about the world around us. So that's our structure. within that, we take decisions. So, for example, one of the decisions we take is we think children should know the names of simple geographical features. Now, that's not in the EYFS anyway. It doesn't say anywhere in the EYFS children have to know what a mountain is or what a sea is or what a river is, but we teach it because we know it's important. So part of what we do all the time is interpret that big structure and say, what do children need to know? Do they need to know what geographical features are? Yes, they need to have a basic understanding of that. So let's take one of those. This is one part of one element of something that's not in the EYFS that you are teaching. And you will recognize this. You will be able to transfer this to what you do. And it gives you a sense of the complexity of what you do quite naturally, quite instinctively, but how you deliver curriculum. So we're going to take the idea of a forest. Okay. So coverage is saying to the children, when there's lots of trees together, it's called a forest. That's it. You could do that and then you've covered it. You can tick it off. But we know that by the time you finish talking, they'd forgotten about that. We know as early as educators to have a concept of forest is much bigger than just telling them what a forest is. So we talk about progression and depth as a way of making the concept of forest real to them. So you probably, if you can, you would go to a forest and you would go to forest because you know it's not until you're actually inside the forest you understand the forestness of a forest. It's a very different place to be. It sounds different, it smells different, it feels different. The light is dappled. You suddenly see something fly from a branch. All of those things add to the nature, with a small n, of what a forest is like. So you might in the forest then make creations. This is from a forest school session where children made things using forest materials. Every time you're doing that, although you're covering all sorts of things, you are fundamentally increasing their understanding of a forest. It's a multi-sensory, multifaceted experience, and it connects to that word, the word forest. So every time you say the word forest or they hear the word forest, they start retrieving all these experiences and they know what a forest means. And you might bring those back to your setting and have them in your resource areas. Again, what you're doing here is curriculum delivery. You're delivering the depth of understanding of what we mean by the word forest. So every time they pick up a leaf or a pine cone or a piece of wood, it connects them back that experience. And probably you would read stories about forests. And I chose forests deliberately. Forests have a huge role in children's literature. Many of the stories, traditional tales, are set in forests. Little Red Riding Hood, Goldilocks and Three Bears, Hansel and Gretel. If you've never been to a forest, you don't understand why Hansel and Gretel being left in the forest is so scary, because you don't know where you are. You can get disorientated really quickly. If you've never been in a forest, you wouldn't understand why Goldilocks and Three Bears is so significant. She gets lost. Same with Red Riding Hood. She's walking through the forest. There's a wolf creeping along beside her. And she looks, she might not see it because it hides behind a tree. If you've never been in a forest, you can't understand that. So by doing all those things, this is one single element of one aspect of one area of learning. We are deepening that understanding so children develop that as a concept and it's embedded within their reality, within what they understand. We could go on. We could, often talk about the difference between core knowledge. So we all want children to know these things. That's core knowledge that we think in order to be successful and to engage with the world and to understand it and to see their place within it, children need to be able to name what those things are. But I also talk about personal knowledge. So many children will get fascinated by the whole idea of forests and they'll want to take it further and further. Not all children, but some children. So you might talk about the difference between deciduous and evergreen forests and talk about why they're different. Talk about, leaves, time of year when leaves come off. They do with some and they do with other trees. Why does that happen? You might start generating those big questions. You might start encouraging children to support their own learning journeys within that, to ask their own questions. You know, you're following that fascination. You're going way beyond what we might describe as core knowledge, deep into personal knowledge, and so on. So when we talk about curriculum and when we talk about depth and progression, we're talking about immersing children in ideas, not just telling them things, but making sure they have this deep level understanding. So when they hear the word forest, it immediately triggers a whole set of multi-sensory experiences. And again, I'm making it sound really complicated, but you are doing this all the time. You are doing this because intuitively, as early as teachers, we know it's not just enough to tell children things. They have to experience them in order to absorb them and understand them. And that brings us, you know, as I said, to the characteristics of effective learning. A key part of the curriculum is the areas of learning and development, the curriculum, the sort of subject content, if you like. But the characteristics of effective learning are equally important because they enable that idea of deep level learning, and they also enable that idea, Lillian Katz's idea of intellectual pursuit. So those learning behaviours which underpin that become really important and critical. And we must always remember these are part of the curriculum. This is what we want children to know. It's what we will teach them. It's as much part of the curriculum as language development, physical development, and mathematical development. Interesting document, it's nearly 2 years old actually, which is from Ofsted, which published to look at how children learn. Interesting enough, and I'll pull out some key parts of this. The apparently, although this isn't public yet, maybe, part of the new framework is going to look at language development, which is not a surprise, but it's also going to look very specifically at executive functioning, a key learning behaviour, as an indicator of how secure quality and learning is within different settings. So if you haven't read this document, probably a 30-40 minute read, really interesting overview, which pulls together a number of things that I've talked about. So when they talk about curriculum pedagogy, curriculum considers all that all children should learn, plenty of opportunity for children who are disadvantaged, so on. Practitioners choose activities and experiences after they've determined the curriculum. So there's a big distinction here between what children do and what children learn. So the learning is the curriculum. How they do that can be, as I said, infinite. There are an infinite number of ways of delivering the curriculum. And certainly we have seen a shift from focusing on what children are doing to what children are learning. In some senses, in the nicest possible way, it doesn't matter what they do. It matters that their learning is progressing and they're accessing the curriculum. Part of that is what we describe as learning behaviours. So the characteristics start that process, but they need extending. So the Education Endowment Foundation defined this as a learning behaviour as a behaviour necessary for a person to learn effectively in the group setting or in the classroom. So what do children need to be successful now? We saw those earlier from the research, things like self-regulation, things like executive functioning, things like metacognition, inhibitory control, memory retrieval. So my definition of learning behaviours is this enables children to access and work with knowledge. So it's not just having knowledge, it's being able to use it. So think about the child with the bumble snake. That was working with the knowledge they had and connecting it together. Also to endow knowledge with context and purpose. And that's Lillian Katz's view of intellectual pursuit. Children acquire knowledge because they want to use it, because it means something to them, and because they want to use it in following what they think is important. And we talk a lot about that in early years. We talk a lot about following children's interests, about their fascinations, and that's right that we do that, because one of the strongest drivers of learning is motivation. When children are motivated to do things, they inevitably pick up the learning behaviours that they require. So can they be progressive? So as I said, the characteristics are a single statement, and I disagree with that. I think we need to look at how they're sequenced. Can they be progressive, and can we assess them? Well, yes, we can. This is some work I did with actually it's an international school where we looked at different elements and what they looked like in terms of phases. So this was a kindergarten. We started at 2, went to 6 as a typical kindergarten, and rather than look at ages, we looked at the stage of development. So there was a very clear intentionality that cognition, like executive functioning, cognitive flexibility, weren't fixed. They were progressive, and they worked with the more sort of discrete content of the curriculum, but alongside delivering those elements, educators and teachers and practitioners are really conscious of foregrounding those things as part of the curriculum, and they assess them as well. So they were looking, when they talked about progress, they weren't just talking about progress in language or physical development, they were talking about progress in metacognition, well-being, and so on. So what we need to do as a profession is really grapple with this, really extend this into the curriculum. This is part of what we're teaching children. It's part of what they're learning. It runs alongside the more kind of, as I said, discrete content, but it's equally important. So finish off with some official stuff, just so that you can sort of see it in practice. So this is from Dr. Julian Grenier's book about what we working with the revised EYFS, which is downloadable. I think you can buy it on Amazon, but you can also download it as a PDF. And again, he talks about what we mean as curriculum, top level plan, what we want children to learn. Supporting their language is a critical element to that, not just, as I said, because of communication, but language is important because it's how we process thought and how we retrieve memory. The curriculum needs to be ambitious. We shouldn't be putting ceilings on it. We should extend it as far as children need to go. And language is a really good example of that. Children love big words, and done properly and done in context, it makes absolute sense. When I taught nursery, we did quite a lot of science, and we used words like hypothesis and conclusion, and children would start to use it in their everyday and understand what it means. There's, interest in dinosaurs, they know words like diplodocus and pterodactyl and herbivore and omnivore. We shouldn't be limiting that. My best anecdote for this is when I was a teacher, we did a project on animals. And we had a reception class with the project animals, and we explored it fully. Some months later, after we'd finished that, a parent came up to me with a child, and she said, "Oh, you look really tired." And I said, "Oh, I've had to be up all night, so I had to do this work, which had to be finished today." And the child said, "Mr. Dubiel, that means you're nocturnal." And I remember thinking, fantastic. He took that word. That is absolutely right, because we had talked about nocturnal animals like badgers and owls and teenagers. No, I don't mean that. But he'd taken that word and he'd applied it to what I'd said. So ambition, particularly in language, I think is really important. Young children's learning is often driven by their interests. Plans need to be flexible, which we've touched on, and depth, that final point. Depth in learning is much more important. To fully understand concepts, knowledge, and ideas is where we need to make sure we focus what we're doing. And good learning behaviours enable us to do that. So this is from the DFE curriculum is what you want children to learn, the time with you. It's based on the EYFS because it's statutory through the 7 areas of learning and the characteristics, which they've missed off by accident. You decide how best to deliver those by creating curriculum unique to your setting. The curriculum belongs to you. Nobody can give you a curriculum. They can give you framework and aspirations. They can give you a structure that you might work with, but the actual curriculum and the actual way that you enable that for children has to belong to you. You start with the EYFS, 7 programs of learning. You break down the high-level curriculum to smaller steps. what you want the children to learn, the activities you do with them, and how you support their learning. So remember, the definition of teaching with a small t is it's not just about formal instruction. Everything you do is teaching. The way you set up the environment is teaching. The way you sometimes don't intervene if a child is doing something is part of teaching, because what you're teaching is you're teaching them to be independent. You're teaching them to make mistakes and to learn from their mistakes. And that's, one of the biggest judgments we make as early as educators, and when not to intervene in children's activity. You might use development matters, although it's non-statutory, and you could use anything and it's unique. Watch your children, study how they work, talk to parents, find their interests, find what drives and motivates them, and listen to what children say that provides clues about the curiosities and interests. And again, we need to check our assumptions on this, because sometimes if we don't see things as a child, we make judgments or assumptions or conclusions about children which aren't accurate. Again, one of my favorite anecdotes for this is a child in a setting who was really interested in the Brio train track. So every day the child came in, they made a train track and they pulled the trains around. So the adults assumed that child was interested in the trains. So they brought lots of different things, bridges and turntables and tunnels, and the child didn't use them. They carried on just making a track and putting the trains around. And then they did what I should have done at the beginning, which was talk to the child. And they found that actually what the child was interested in was the magnets on the train. And it was the magnets that really fascinated them. So once they found this out, they provided the child with magnets, and they didn't go back to the Brio train deck because that's the only place they found them. So sometimes we need to be quite careful in assuming what children are interested in. It's important not to use the early learning goals as the basis for your curriculum. And that's true. That's absolutely right. The early learning goals are the script or our aspirations for the end of reception. You do have to demonstrate how your children are going to get there eventually, and how the trajectory of what you're doing will ultimately lead to the early learning goals by the end of reception, even if you're not in a reception class. But that's just a sense of destination, if you like. You're on a journey and you're pacing out that journey as children do that. Also worth just to consider what inspectors look at to consider progress. So I talked about the curriculum being progressive, its content and progress. Ofsted consider the curriculum as a progression model. By this we mean children know more and remember more. More was intended in curriculum, which are the EYFS learning and development requirements. So know more and remember more, and what progress might mean. And they give some examples there which are kind of quite interesting. So we are looking at children internalizing their knowledge and using their knowledge. The more knowledge and understanding they have, the more they're able to think creatively. As I said, the boy with the bumble snake couldn't have done that if he didn't know about snakes and he didn't know about bumblebees. So that was taught knowledge which he absorbed and then utilized. So those things go together really critically. So just finish off 3 minutes, some key principles. Progress is accumulative. Children gain, refine, internalize skills and knowledge and behaviors. All of that is the curriculum. We can and should expect that progress occurs. Children get better at things. They learn more language. They learn to describe things more effectively. They think differently. They develop their thoughts. They spend longer, more intensely involved in things. All those are indicators that children are making progress, and we should expect to see that. If we don't, then that's a question we need to reflect on. Progress is linear. Progress is accumulative, particularly in some aspects of the curriculum, but it's also non-linear. And curriculum is at its peak when it is owned by the child, when they use that knowledge, particularly in their self-led learning. I'm not going to talk about assessment today, but if we were talking about assessment, we only really know that children know what we think they know when they do it independently in their self-led learning. When children count independently without being asked to count, we know that counting and understanding number is so embedded in what they do, they're doing it naturally as part of their everyday. That's how we know what we've taught has landed. Delivering an early is curriculum, securing and progressing knowledge and concepts so they can utilize this in their own activity, which is what I've just said. What is directly and sometimes formally taught needs to be done so in a way that enable the child to use it effectively. So we do things in context, we do things that are meaningful and connect with what makes sense to children. So that example of the forest, of deeply immersing them in the forestness of the forest, and we could say that is just one word in the whole panoply of things that we teach them. But actually think how that builds into their knowledge, their understanding, their perception of the world. So the curriculum is derived from this framework, is the central core of expectation. So we have the early learning goals of expectation at the end. This form a strategy and supplemented by the experiences provided. So you look at that trajectory and you look at how you work towards that. A curriculum is a broad direction of travel. It gives you a sense of the elements of the kinds of things children need to learn. Now they're outlined quite clearly in the EYFS, but within that there's a journey from the starting point towards that at the end, and that's what we mean by curriculum. How are we making sure they're both making steps of progress sequentially, but also that knowledge is real. It's deepened by what they're doing. And the direct teaching aspects is vital to introduce what needs to be learned. So children need knowledge and information. They need input. And when we do that effectively, that's internalized and they then make sense of it. So I'm going to stop because it's 7 o'clock and hand you back, I think, to Felicity to see if there are any questions or discussions arising out of this.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, has anybody got any thoughts or questions they'd like to ask Jan? There's a couple of things in the chat. So Jan's people are just asking, can they receive the slides after you've
Oh yes, yeah, I'll send you a PDF of that
that's
as soon
brilliant.
as this finishes. Yes.
Thank you. So any thoughts? Very clear and informative. Oh, gone dark.
Sorry, I just stop the share. There we are. That's better. Sorry.
So what are people's thoughts on that? It's great to see you making reference and use of the help for providers information, because that we use that a lot in terms of thinking of, I think it's a great resource and not many people do use it, and which is fabulous. I'm really interested in the slide that you put up around executive functioning, metacognition and cognitive flexibility. Was that the third term? I didn't quite, was it cognitive?
Which
The slide that you've done with
the sequence?
yeah, the sequencing,
Yes.
from phase 1, yeah.
Yeah.
And I try and filter it through what I know, which is the Piaget's assimilation, accommodation, disequilibration, to see if I can try and make those connections through that process. You challenge me.
Well, it's interesting because that's not my that's their curriculum. So when I worked with them, those were the things they wanted to pull out, and like I said, it's often very different. So that school particularly wanted to connect it very strongly to what was happening later in school as part of that continuum, which I completely agree with. So the terminology they used was very sort of technical terminology. And that, yeah, those were those statements. It's not for me to agree or disagree with them. That's what they wanted to use, and then they went on, I think, post that to sort of exemplify what they meant by that. But it was, but yeah, it's interesting.
It is interesting, and they're very schooly terms, aren't they? And I think with early years, it's thinking about what we know and do. And when you said earlier, it's about meaningful learning. working with what you know. I mean, I would say that's where early years practitioners are really strong and robust, is getting to know the child and
Yeah.
really thinking about the child. And I loved your analogy in terms of the train, because we often talk about what is the child learning? How many times do you talk to practitioners and they say, oh, he's really interested in superheroes? And so, yeah, so what are you doing to support it? And they're, well, we're buying this and we're buying that. But actually, what are they learning? What is it that they're actually, is it about that sense of self and that
Yeah.
transformation of state from one thing to another thing? Or, is it just about the mechanism and the connectivity and the social aspect with other people?
Mm.
Is it because it comes with the sword? And actually, there's something around
Is it
that.
about dressing up? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
So
yeah.
what is it about? But yeah, the really positive things in the chat. I'm just going to go back to a couple of things. There was one, somebody just asked, what is the help for providers? So Becky's just said that we'll put a link to that. But if you just Google help for providers, you'll see there's some really really good stuff in terms of video vignettes around the 7 areas of learning. You might see the odd familiar face. Around thinking about PSED, for example, communication and language, but also about the curriculum and what does that look like in practice, which is really helpful. Em's put was very well explained and made great sense to me, got me thinking, thank you. Jenny, hi Jenny. I love it as a childminder, we often can't read what you've just said. We often fine tune to the child, and I find it really interesting how children learn, even those whose first language isn't English. Absolutely, and that's really important. But it's stepping back, isn't it, and really thinking about what the child is doing. Absolutely brilliant. I love the reference to the geography curriculum work with Key Stage 1 with a lot of EAL and offering a range of experience is really important. Thank you. So anybody would, while we've got this gentleman here, would anybody like to ask any specific questions? Holly.
Holly's got.
Hi, Anne. Lovely to see you.
Hello.
You're right. I mean, for me, I could listen to it all day. I think I've started to do a little bit of research more into maybe what's happening in early years provisions in schools, and in reception classes and into Key Stage 1. So some early pieces of research for my MA. But I think what really struck me listening to you today is how much children, in particularly in school-based settings, are actually following their intellectual pursuits. Some of the feedback that I get, around those sorts of schemes of work, it's very narrow, and I'm not sure if children are really getting to that deep level learning aspect. Obviously there's a lot of pressures and a lot of predetermined ideas happening, and not through the fault of the teachers. They absolutely know what good practice is, but it's quite interesting what you were saying, and and the the Salio work and Cat's work. It's
it's interesting. I think there's always been, I think it's about professional confidence, because everything that I've talked about is possible within the UIFS. But I think you need to be confident to both be able to do it, but also be able to articulate it. I think, as educators, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, it comes with the territory that you have to be an advocate for why we do what we do, because much of what we do is counterintuitive. It's not the same as teaching like 9-year-olds or 12-year-olds. And sometimes the people who take those decisions come from that background, and it takes some kind of education to see how that continuum flows, how children, in order for children to be good writers, for example, yes, of course they need the physical, they need the technicals, but they need to know that writing is important. They need to have a drive to be curious and motivated to do writing. So it's kind of explaining all that. But interesting thing, I'll just throw this in because you are talking about schools. Some of you, and I don't know whether you've picked up on this, so you might remember before the election, David Bell was asked to review early years policy for the Labour Party, and before he reported, the election took place. I think we were all kind of taken by surprise. So that report isn't going to be published. but it was bits of it have been leaked. So there was an article in TS. Now, you have to be kind of eagle-eyed to spot it, but one of the things he talks about is a qualification for early years, and he talks about birth to 7.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was involved in a couple of submissions, one to the NHT and one with Julie Fisher, and what we talked about was the encouragement to think about a kindergarten phase, and they were really interested in that. So I was saying to Felicity before this, I'm a ridiculously optimistic person. I would like to think that there's a slow burn here of actually getting a kindergarten. If we had a kindergarten phase in England, that would change a lot of the things that you just talked about, Holly. Because I think the thing about reception is it's on the cusp of year 1, and the expectations crank up in year 1 because of the national curriculum. If we had a highly aspirational and highly well-researched curriculum that actually went from birth to 7, that incorporated year 1, I think that would change the landscape. And I'm saying that as a convert, because I used to think, oh, it doesn't matter, actually, it's the context that happens. It doesn't. Then I worked in a kindergarten system in China. When I worked in Hong Kong and in China, we worked with government bilingual kindergartens, which came under the auspices of the Chinese government, Ministry of Education, and they were kindergartens. I went from 2 to 7 to year 1. So when I created a curriculum framework, it was from 2 to 7, and you just think this just makes sense to see that as a single continuum, to recognise early childhood for what it is, which is birth to 7, not birth to 5 as we have in the UK. So I hear what you're saying, Holly, and I think that would be great. In the meantime, I think it is about in empowering and engendering professional confidence to say, actually, this is what I know is right for children. This is what I know is going to lead to those good outcomes.
Yeah, and it's the child voice in it as well, isn't it? When
Absolutely.
I look at curriculum planning and curriculum design, there's often the child's voice is not present anywhere.
Not present. No,
you've
absolutely.
talked about it needs to belong to the setting or the school. It needs to belong to the child and the family, and I feel like that's probably an aspect that's getting lost in terms of curriculum.
Absolutely, and I think particularly when you have an off-the-shelf curriculum, it can't do any of that. It can't physically can't do any of that because it's not connected to where it lands. So
it feels a little bit backwards because I mean, when I first started teaching, like 2000, we used to follow QCA schemes all the time, and it was a done thing. And I don't know if they're starting to creep in since the introduction of the phonics schemes. It feels like they're just starting to creep back in again.
Well, there are a lot of schemes out there, and schools I work with, they often subscribe to. I mean, there's some kind of fairly prominent ones, but I think in good settings where educators have that confidence, they adapt and shape them and make them take ownership of them. So even though they're following a scheme, they're not allowing themselves to be prescribed by it. They're still kind of working within it. So it's an interesting time because I as I said at the beginning, I do think our time has come, and I do think people are finally recognizing the impact of what we do, that it's not just childcare. What we're doing is massively enhancing children's life chances by interacting with them effectively, by having a sense of curriculum. So I think that's a challenge we should meet and work with. But yeah. But I think the professional confidence is key to that, absolutely.
And it just seems so strange, doesn't it? There's so many countries where the start age of school is 7, and actually by the time the children leave school, they're doing so much better than our children. Whereas our model is to teach them from a younger age, formally teach them from a younger age, instead of having that real play-based curriculum. And I think it's that concept of play isn't necessarily valued by our culture in the way that it is in other cultures.
No, I think perceptions of childhood are really different. I mean, it's interesting. I'll give you an interesting analogy because I'm sure you all know why we start children at school in 5 here, because it was part of the 1870 Act, and the members of Parliament didn't want their 12-year-olds in in school instead of in their factory, so everything was shunted down. So rather than go to 6 to 12, which was a recommendation, we go to 5 to 11. So that's the basis on which schooling was derived. Interestingly, I was once at a conference with someone from Finland, and we were talking about this. And in Finland, they started primary school around about the same time, sort of late 1800s. And I said, how did they decide on the age of 7, which was when they start formal school? And he said, the age of 7 was decided because that was the age that children could walk or ski independently to their local school. So in Finland, they go with what can the child do independently? In England, it was no, we want to keep them in the factories. And I think, I come from a European background. My mother was Danish, so we have the whole perception of what childhood is and how that fits into what we want for children is very, very different. And I do think we wrestle with that. I do think there is a cultural residue in the UK. So I think to get a kindergarten phase, which I think would be brilliant, we will come up against the most vociferous, hostile challenge to that. So and I think we need to be ready. We need to be ready with what we know, what we believe, what our values are, but also, how we construct that notion of child and how that fits within the education system. Yeah,
A previous Labour leader did ask me that very question about what my views and perspective were on children starting school at 7. It was joy to my ears.
Who asked you that?
A previous Labour leader.
Oh, okay.
So it'd be interesting to see if that legacy is still staying.
Yeah, well, I think we can always be hopeful, and I think we are in a different landscape in all sorts of ways. So it's like I said, I'm ridiculously optimistic about everything.
So are there any other questions or thoughts or reflections? No, everybody's getting hungry or wanting a glass of wine or discreetly drinking wine with their cameras off. Okay. Well, okay. Thank you very much then, Jan. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed it. And I'm sure if people do have reflections and things, we can always, bring things together and share them with you. I'm assuming if needs be.
Absolutely. Of course.
Brilliant.
Yeah. No, that'd be
Thank
cool.
you, Jan. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you for getting up your evening and enjoy whatever it is you're going to do next.
Brilliant.